chapter 26, verses 6 through 13. And I'm going to read that as part of the sermon, so I will read that in a few moments. 3 old men were playing cards one afternoon. The first one said, "Sometimes I get undressed to get into the shower, and I can't remember whether I'm getting in or getting out." The second one said, "Yeah, I know what you mean. Sometimes I find myself on the stairs and I can't remember whether I'm going up or coming down." And the third one said, "Well, so far I haven't had any of that kind of trouble. I guess I'll just knock on wood and hope that doesn't happen to me." And then he looked at the door. He said, "I wonder who that is." Well, memory is a powerful gift when it works. But as we age, and there's quite a few of us here with white hair, our memory is affected, especially short-term memory. And that's the storage and retrieval of information about events that happened recently. How many of us can relate to mild memory loss when we can't remember where we put our car keys? Or when we neglected to get all the groceries at the store because we forgot our list? That happens to me too. Well, I want you to know this hope, because according to an article in Psychology Today magazine, some mild memory loss is expected, and it usually begins when we're a bit over 50. When we're no longer able to recall the name of a person or a place or an object, the first thing that comes through our mind is that we have some kind of dementia coming on. But you know, this kind of memory loss, we're told, is normal. And it even has a name. It's called benign forgetfulness. It's not very benign when it's happening to you, is it? It's a memory that remains intact, but our ability to retrieve it is temporarily impaired. And so usually we try to describe that word, right, or that person for the person that we're speaking with, and then the person we're speaking with says, "Oh, you mean," and instantly we recall, yes, that's what we meant. So it's not like we've completely forgotten that thing, it's just that we can't recall it. Well, another reason we may have trouble remembering is due to a lack of concentration. We have so much bombarding our minds all the time, especially when we're multitasking or if we're in an emotional state. Now, in attenuated age, or in people who are affected by dementia, short-term memory all but disappears. I remember my mother in the last years of her life. She lived with me for the last 14 years of her life. She died at 93, and she had dementia, and it really started showing when she was about 85. It was a slow decline, but the last few years she really had forgotten most everything. But she vividly remembered all of her siblings. I mean, she was born in 1914. She remembered everything that happened in her childhood. She remembered everybody who was dead, basically. She remembered my father, and she remembered all of her children and most of the grandchildren's names. But the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren were unknown to her. And I'd sit down and I'd show her photos of all these little babies and little kids. And she'd say they were so cute. And she'd say, "But who are they?" She hadn't a clue who these kids were. And even some of the older ones who had grown up and were now married had somehow slipped from her mind. And you know, my mother lived with me all those years, and when we go to the doctor and the doctor would do those memory tests, you know, they'd ask you 3 things, ball, table, and window or something, and you have to 5 minutes later tell what it was. But one of the questions they always ask on a dementia test is, "Where do you live?" Well, my mother would always say Medfield, because she lived there for 40 years, but she had lived with me in Hanson for probably 10 years at that point. But she still lived in Medfield in her mind. So memory is important, because it helps us to organize and mark the times of our lives. And every one of us has precious memories that punctuate our life stories. Now, tomorrow is a day that we set aside to celebrate our memories. And there are some things and some people we never want to forget. And Memorial Day gives us that formal opportunity to remember those people. And though Memorial Day originated with remembering those who died while serving our country, specifically in the Civil War, today we celebrate by remembering all of our loved ones who have died. And many of us will visit the cemetery tomorrow. We will visit the graves of our loved ones and we'll place flowers or a wreath there. and we'll say a prayer of thanks. And we'll pause to remember how our lives have been affected by those whom we remember. And we will thank God for our memories of those loved ones. But you know, remembrance is a theme that runs through the Bible. Did you know that memory or remembrance is a word that appears over 300 times in the Bible? So it's an important theme. But remembering is usually attributed to God. Very early in Genesis, we read that God remembered Noah and dried up the flood so that Noah and his family could begin a new life. And God made the first rainbow in the sky so that he would remember his covenant with Noah, that he would never again destroy the earth through a flood. And then in Exodus, God heard the Israelites groaning under the yoke of slavery in Egypt, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham. So he called Moses to lead them out of Egypt into the land he promised. And then God remembered the prayers of Rachel and Hannah and blessed them with sons. And in many of the Psalms, we see God remembering the frailty of humanity. God remembered that they were but flesh, a passing breeze that does not return. God knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust. God remembers his covenant forever, the promise he made for 1,000 generations. The Lord remembers his people and will bless them. And Jesus told his disciples that every time that we break bread together in communion, we do this in memory of him. At the very end of the Bible, we read in Revelation that God's final judgment comes because he remembers the sins of the world piled up to heaven. God's memory is emphasized over and over again in his determination to keep his promises of salvation. But when remembering is attributed in the Bible to people, the prevailing theme is that we should remember God's faithfulness to us in continually working for our salvation. Psalm 143 says, I remember the days of long ago. I meditate on all your works and consider what your hands have done. Many times we're told to remember as a command from God. You might remember one of the 10 Commandments, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And in Ecclesiastes we find this wise counsel, and this was part of our call to worship. Remember the Creator in the days of your youth before the days of trouble come, and the years approach when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. So memory is what helps us to recall the who's and what's and where's and when's of life, and we organize our memory in narrative patterns. And so memories evoke stories of life over time. In biblical memory also evokes the story of God and humankind over history. Biblical memory sweeps from the beginning of time up to the present, projecting into the future and on into eternity, and its main figure is God. But I can think of only one account in all of the Bible where memory is applied to a single person. She was a woman whose name we will never know, but she must have been known to Jesus because a woman in Jesus' time would never do what she did, not being known to him. So here from Matthew 26, verses 6 through 13, the anointing at Bethany. When Jesus was in Bethany in the home of a man named Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which she poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. Aware of this, Jesus said to them, why are you bothering this woman? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. When she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for my burial. I tell you the truth. Whenever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. A woman in Jesus' time would never have walked off the street into a dinner party uninvited. Yet we're told that she comes into this house of Simon, who was formerly a leper, with her alabaster jar of luxurious perfume. And in one extravagant gesture of love, she walked right over to Jesus and poured the whole precious oil over his head. And we're not told about the look she must have exchanged with Jesus as she made this intimate gesture. Were her eyes filled with sorrow, or his with deep love for her? And she alone among the guests seemed to know the gravity of the moment. This was Jesus' last supper before the Last Supper, the night that he would go to his death. And so she wanted to anoint the body of her Lord and Savior to prepare him for his death with the finest preparation that money could buy, because it was her love that was poured out of that alabaster jar, caressing her Lord as she would never again be able to do. The disciples were angry at the profligate show of the woman's attention. What a waste! We could have sold that perfume and given the money to the poor. Yet how wrong they were. Yes, this woman's action was extraordinary and her gift was of great value. But the perfume was only the gesture. The real treasure was the sacrificial love that she poured out over Jesus, because she and she alone understood the sacrifice of love that he would soon make for her and all of humanity as he paid the ultimate price of sacrifice on the cross. Jesus knew the depth of the woman's sacrifice, and he praised her, saying, "She has done a beautiful thing to me." There is no sacrifice greater than the one that Jesus made for you and for me. And there is nothing that we can do on his behalf, no matter how costly, that Jesus would ever call a waste. Like the woman who most likely spent all she had on this gift for her Lord. When you or I give all we have to Jesus, it's a beautiful thing. If we believe this story, shouldn't we also boldly uncap the alabaster jars of our precious possessions and pour them out for Jesus? Because nothing that we give the Lord is ever wasted. And no sacrifice made for Jesus is ever forgotten. Centuries later, this is 2,000 years later, we're here. We're talking about the loving faith of this woman that is still told in memory of her. And perhaps the gospel writer Matthew did not record her name because her story is one in which any faithful lover of Christ could insert his or her name. But certainly the name is not so important. It is the complete gift of faith and love that is memorable. The act of love of this unnamed woman lifted from this moment that wrote her into the story of God. And that is where any faithful follower of Jesus wants to be, connected to him and to his story, the salvation of the world. Because Jesus said, wherever this gospel is preached, she will be remembered. And when we are faithful disciples bringing Christ's gospel into the world, we connect to his story and we become part of it. It's a story that transcends our lives and our time and time itself. Isn't that amazing? Isn't it exciting to know that you're part of his story? But is it really so important to be remembered here on earth? Now that quote I read from Daniel Webster reveals that most of the true heroes in lives receive no memorial etched in stone, but engraved usually by sorrow on the human heart. And so when life is gone, if we have loved well, our memory will survive for a time. But there is a memory that lasts forever, and it's written in eternity. And it is here that you want your name to be written and remembered. Just as Jesus knew the name of this unnamed woman, he knows your name, and he knows mine. When we die, the Bible tells us that the names of those who belong to him will be written in the book of life. And only those wose names appear there will live with him in heaven forever. And so on Memorial Day, we remember those loved ones who are gone. But when you are gone, how will you be remembered? Let us pray. Lord God, our Creator and Sustainer, you remember the promises you make forever, and you never fail to keep them. And those who belong to you, your treasured possessions, the ones who have accepted the gift you gave through the extravagant sacrifice of love by your Son Jesus on the cross, you never forget. Though we know not the names of all who love you, like the name of this unknown woman, we are all known by one name, Christian, a lover of Christ. And as our names are also unknown, yet you know us all, even to the very depths of our hearts and spirits. And you call us your beloved. You remember us and you bless us. And when we remember our promise to you and give extravagantly of all that we have, our most precious possession of life itself, poured out like a sweet perfume into the lives around us, because we cannot anoint your precious head. Its sweet aroma reaches heavenward to you, and your Spirit whispers to us, you have done a beautiful thing to me.